To me, it was the hand of God giving me a chance to change my stars. And I think from that moment on, I have worked tirelessly to try and be worthy of that opportunity.
Hello and welcome to HolisticCircle podcast, Spiritual Conversation. My name is Philipp Kobald. We are reaching out to people who are passionate about spreading light, love, and joy, and knowledge and more knowledge. And welcome here, Guy Morris. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Phil. Pleasure to be here.
I'm going to enjoy so very much today. I love a good story. I love a good book. So you're my kind of a guest. But
Thank you.
before I let you loose and wide and back and forward in history all over the place, just for my viewers, why are we here today? You know, it's a spiritual podcast. You've been used to a lot from me, but why do we have an author? It makes sense, but let me quick say a couple of personal words, because the fun thing about a spiritual journey, a spiritual search, it always has a beginning. And for many people, it starts as a young fellow reading books like Master and Marguerite or Name of the Rose, or for me, it was Don Quixote. These are these inspirational works. And of course, then down the square, and of course, Da Vinci Code and the new generation, Harry Potter. But by the end of the day, and of course, Guy Morris, that's why we're here. People need this inspiration. People need to get awakened. People, the dream has to start, and wherever the journey might get more serious or different over the years, but we all need that inner flame being kissed awake. And so I'm super, super stoked to have you here today to little bit get the background of a person who is inspiring the next generation of seekers, who is giving the little seeds into the people's minds to start their journey. And with this, the floor is yours. Mr. Morris, please tell us a little of your background to get the ball rolling.
Philip, thank you for that very gracious, very kind introduction. I'm not sure I'm worthy of it. I'm just a nerd who likes to solve things and ask questions and gets absorbed in the things that I want to understand. My background is a little bit unusual, not entirely so, but my journey started as a homeless runaway at age 13. I came from a very violent, very disruptive background, of which I never talk about, in part because what I can remember is very disruptive. What I can't, but I've lost amnesia for most of my childhood. So I tell people my journey started at 13, and I started as an individual trying to figure out how to make my way on my own without anybody's help, with believing that I had to rely on myself to survive. And there was a strong truth in that. But there was a saying I used to tell myself for many, many years, which was, I can't allow my past to define my future. I wanted to define my future in a different, unique way than what I would have grown up believing and being taught and experiencing. I just knew that it had to be different. And by a series of miracles, I can only call them that, because I didn't have an SAT score. I hadn't applied to college. I dropped out in the 10th grade. At that point, I had already gone to 16 different schools. I was not a good student. I was accepted into college, and a benefactor offered to pay my tuition. And I was so blown away. To me, it was the hand of God giving me a chance to change my stars. And I think from that moment on, I have worked tirelessly to try and be worthy of that opportunity. Now, it started with working my fanny off at college. I ended up with multiple degrees. I got a scholarship for graduate school. I was accepted into Harvard, and it was all because I developed a macroeconomic model that outperformed the Federal Reserve and changed how the whole world develops economic models to this day. And that kicked me off into a 4-decade Fortune 500 career with companies in global energy and high tech and software for companies like Occidental Petroleum and IBM and Oracle and Microsoft, where I reported to VPs and CXOs, and I was a known innovator and thought leader, and the guy who you would send in to say, well, everybody else has failed, let's send in Morris and see if he could do something. And so my entire career was having to prove myself over and over and over and over again. I got used to it. Now, While I was homeless was when I accepted the Lord, and I started my spiritual journey. Up until that point, there was nothing in my household. There were violence and alcohol and crime, and that was. And I started in a Christian church, and I went to several, and some of them were absolutely influential in developing me, and others were lessons in how truth could be corrupted for personal gain or personal ego or profit or other things. And there was part of that journey, and I think the reason we came here today was to talk about my journey around the study of prophecy. And at the time, this was decades ago, I had reached a conclusion that the way most teachers taught prophecy was either wrong or it was so saturated in allegory and metaphor and mythology to be almost incomprehensible, to the point where, and this is true, where one teacher would interpret it this way and another teacher would interpret allegories another way. And many teachers would use it to try and predict the future of what would happen and who the villains would be and how things would take place. And they were almost always incorrect. And so I being an analytical mind and a kind of a systems developer kind of mind, I was frustrated. And I took it on myself to say, well, either prophecy is just a metaphor about good and evil at the end, or it's coded in a way that's not being interpreted well. So I said, well, the only way for me to figure this out, since I had an inherent distrust of other people, was to say, I need to figure this out for my own. I need to dig into it. I need to find a way to either understand whether it's completely meaningless, especially in our age. And that was a time back in the 70s, there was the Left Behind series. There was a lot of people talking about rapture and all these other end time prophecies. There was a part of me that said, no, that just doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound credible. I don't know the scriptures that well, but somehow that just sounds off. And so I decided to study myself. And to start, I had to kind of start by listening and reading a lot of other people's books. And all of it just confused me even more. They were looking at it. It didn't seem to tie to the modern reality as much as a metaphor of what they thought the future reality would look like. And I was looking for a way to validate where we were. Now, I was inspired by Sir Isaac Newton. In the 1600s, Sir Isaac Newton studied prophecy in secret because he was afraid of what the Catholic Church would do to him if they knew that he was studying this esoteric topic without spiritual guidance. And so we didn't even know that he was studying this until after he died, and we found all kinds of logbooks of his studies. And he took a very calendar-based, he took a unique approach of certain events and certain years and certain dates and tried to predict. He wanted to ask the key question of, when will these things occur? Well, because everyone around me at the time, there were so many people saying we were in the end times, but they all had different reasons for saying that. And I wasn't sure whether I should believe any of them, because there were many times in history people said that it was happening and it wasn't happening. I thought, well, I needed to have a more verifiable framework. I needed to have something where I can say, I can verify it's not an opinion, it's either yes or no. And that needs to have a mathematical component so I can give it value and weight. I didn't want another person's opinion to influence a search for truth. And so I started without basically throwing away most eschatology and almost most theology and most other teachers. And I tried to come up with a framework. And for a while I stumbled until I came across a National Geographic article. It's the way most people study prophecy, right? Spiritual things. Now, in this particular article, it was talking about the loss of fish stocks all over the world. It was a environmental study, and there was a number of studies that basically had claimed in every major fishing ground all over the earth, the fish stocks were down by well over a third. And they had multiple reasons. They had obviously ocean warming and climate change and pollution and acidification, reef dying, whiting of reefs, all of these reasons why the fish stocks would be overfishing would be decreasing. But it struck me because the fact is, the last time we saw a decrease of that magnitude on a global basis was 25 million years ago. Now, prophecy teachers, and it also struck me that there was a prophecy, one of the 7 trumpets, I believe it was, I think it was the 4th one, talked about a flaming rock falling from the sky, landing in the ocean, and a third of the fish of the sea die, and the ocean is polluted. Well, I thought, well, there was no allegory, there was no flaming rock that fell into the sky, but here was a very unique, once in human history experience of a third of the fish of all the nations dying within a single generation. And that started me thinking about how to interpret prophecy and I realized that there were 2 parts of most prophecies. There's an allegorical part, something disastrous, wild and crazy happens. It oftentimes looks like an asteroid or something else. And then there's an outcome or an attribute of how that affected the humanity. And that if I ignored the allegories and focused only on the outcomes, I could validate those outcomes, yes or no. Did that occur or not occur? And I could then, once I validated and got a correlation, it's a mapping of how closely it correlates or validates. A perfect correlation, if it has 10 attributes and you only can validate 6 of them, you've only got a 0.6 correlation. That was too low for me. So I was looking for those things with very high or perfect correlations. And then from that, I could develop probability statements. Well, how often do these outcomes occur in normal human history? And I could then look at things that are, well, that's pretty common or that's quite rare, but it does happen. And there's a few that's never happened before. That's only happened once. And I was finding that I was coming up with more of the only happened once than I was expecting. And so over the past several decades, as just a personal obsession, being a nerdzilla, trying to understand, does prophecy have relevance to me? And if so, how do I validate what that is? And then how do I interpret the results? And then see where it aligns or doesn't align with other teachers. I wanted an independent viewpoint. And so over the last several decades, I have been going through a number of different prophecies, especially in the New Testament, some of the Old Testament ones about the end times, but mostly in the New Testament that talks about the end times, and especially Revelation. And I had been using this framework that I called prophecy analytics to decode what these scriptures, these mysterious, weird, crazy, allegorical scriptures actually mean. And the results were astounding me and wound up reaffirming my faith, not in religion, not in the church, but in the truth of Holy Scripture and the fact that all of us have to find that truth on an individual basis, because spiritual connections is a quantum, I've written about this, it almost has the nature framework of a quantum level connection to an external dimension that we can't see, but we know scientifically it's there. I started combining my scientific understanding with my spiritual understanding and this interpretation of prophecy, that prophecy is not about how an angry deity will come to destroy humanity, but a warning of how humanity will destroy itself. And when I understood that, I realized that there were parallels in the Hindu prophecies, in the Hopi prophecies, and in the Mayan prophecies. And that started changing my spiritual journey. It started changing my faith in the Lord himself. It started changing my understanding and interpretation of scripture. And it started changing my understanding of how to watch the news and how to see the news. And so my thriller books, I started producing thrillers in 2020 to warn the world of a convergence of the power of AI, which I knew about at the time from a number of other reasons from my career, with the corruption of power that we all witness on the television now nightly, but was already starting a couple decades ago. and how that correlates to prophecy in plain sight. Now, my thrillers have all won awards. They're super exciting. It's like the high-tech wow factor of James Bond Q with the globe-trotting velocity of Mission Impossible, the mysterious religious mysteries of Da Vinci Code, and the warm, character-driven humor of Indiana Jones. They're really good, fun books, but they write them in an entertaining way because I'm leaving you with thought-provoking questions about the time we live, the leaders who are leading us, where is it leading us, and what should be our personal spiritual response. So in January, to provide the evidence of and in the series, my book series, I have an AI decoding prophecy, because the way I've done it is more akin to how an artificial intelligence would break things down, as opposed to the dogma-laden versions of other people. And so that was prophecy analytics. Now, one thing to find us out, what finalized and really caught my attention is that right now, the cumulative probability of all the 100% correlations I found, the cumulative probability exceeds 3 trillion to 1.
Or what? For the final prophecy or for the negative outcome?
We're living in a prophetic era. That there are so many prophecies that have high correlations and that are perfectly aligned to which world events. And if we look at the cumulative probability, it's pretty astounding.
To which end? To like an apocalyptic end or to a massive change of reality?
I think that's a good question. One of the themes that I've come out with in the study is that prophecy is never useful in terms of interpreting the future, but understanding the present in greater context, in a spiritual context. I think that many prophecies are misinterpreted. So the end of what we're looking at could be a civilizational end, just as we've seen a collapse of civilization, which we've seen in the past, and that would be a reset to a lot of human systems, or it could be something more apocalyptic. And we now have the means for that we never really ever had before. It doesn't necessarily need to be an asteroid. We could produce that ourselves. And we have the madmen in control of the buttons that could make that happen right now.
Just let me ask one practical question, because I'm always on the practical side before I can ask the questions I actually wanted to ask. But why would you think that 2.5 to 3,000 years ago, people sat down and wrote these prophecies for a time 2,000 years ahead? Why would they have bothered, in a sense? Or why would this be such a unique juncture, not like 1,000 in the future or 3,000 in the future? Why they looked at 2,000 years ago, somebody sitting down and said, oh, in 2,000 years it's going to happen. I better write down a prophecy. I hope they will understand.
I definitely believe there's a divine inspiration. Now, before I want to come back to that in a minute, because I want to explain scientifically where in my book, The Image, where I believe how that relates to the universe. But I believe that sometimes we have these inspirations. Einstein talks about moments of bending of the time fabric where we touch on things. We see paranormal experiences where people touch on things like this. And so there's an interdimensional element that we see these things. Now, the reason why these books are so hard to understand is because, frankly, I don't think the prophet John, when he wrote Revelation, understood the context of what he was writing either, which is why a lot of it came out in hyper-spirituality and allegorical text. And until we strip away the allegories to figure out what his outcomes, how he defines the outcomes, it's hard to, I think he saw a vision of what some of these outcomes were, but really didn't understand how they would come to be. And so I think one of the reasons these texts are hard to understand is because we have a layer of opaqueness to the prophet that he covers up. And we see this in Nostradamus and other things that becomes more allegorical. And it wasn't people are tripping up over the allegory. And it wasn't until I took that away and said, okay, let's say he didn't really understand, but he saw certain outcomes happening and related, and I could relate to that. So I'm not telling you I know how that happened. What I can say is that I've correlated 5 of the 7 seals, 4 of the 7 trumpets, the 7 churches, both beasts, both the dragons, image of the beast, mark of the beast, and even the character known as the man of lawlessness or the Antichrist has direct correlations to the real world. where those correlations couldn't have existed prior to the modern era. And so I'm just saying, part of my writing the book was to say, I don't know what your spirituality basis is, but the universe is giving us warnings that it's time for us to deepen that spirituality to prepare for that chaos to come. Because I can't change what's going on in Washington or Moscow or Beijing or North Korea or elsewhere in Gaza and all the places people are suffering. We can't change all that, but the gospel, the true gospel, true spirituality tells us that we need to embrace each other with love and with compassion and with empathy, and only through that shared commitment to our own society can we overcome those things, and we overcome the trauma within us. So when I was a victim of trauma, and I learned that oftentimes we don't heal from that in isolation. We heal from that by communicating and networking with others and talking about it. So I wrote Prophecy Analytics not to try and convince people. I don't have anything to prove. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a spiritual teacher per se. I do write about spirituality in this sense. And in my own search for the truth, out by realizing I needed to forget the institutional rituals and the institutional regalia and the institutional sometimes taxonomy to understand the core of what our spirituality should be and root myself into that. And as I've done that, some of these things that would normally really agitate me on the world stage don't agitate me as much because I can put them in context to a larger, broader, more spiritual picture.
First thing I actually wanted to say is that the first observation, so to say, if you allow me, that the books and the writing that you do comes out of your own curiosity, of your own searching so that is the basic fundamental motivation. That's always interesting because a lot of those authors I just named, I know that wonders, do they have a message? Do they have an agenda? Or it's just an expression of their own curiosity, which would be a very natural spiritual thing. And I guess with a lot of these authors, it's always a mystery around it. But to me, it sounds very real what you just presented, that you only, if you're so burning for knowledge, burning for the truth, can be years and years of going for archives and making all of these correlations and stuff. I mean, it's not like a 5 minutes job, I guess, what you just...
No, and I had to summarize it down. I had to dummy it down for the book. Otherwise, it would have been like 600 pages. So I was just trying to get people to understand the process, the concepts. I wanted to apply it to enough areas where they could see how it would apply to some of the major themes that people talk about. I was able to debunk certain themes like the rapture. And so it was really more of a saying, when I talk about an AI decoding prophecy in my other books, that's not just me being creative. That's actually based on real analysis I spent years trying to figure out on my own with an honest assessment. I didn't know what the outcome would be. I didn't know that I would be able to correlate so much to, and frankly, the correlations really ratcheted up over the last 10, 15 years. I had a certain level of correlations before that had me interested and curious, but I wasn't convinced. And so I set it aside. I had a busy career. I worked 80-hour weeks. This was something I would do as a major news thing would come up, or somebody would give a sermon that I said, no, that doesn't sound right. And I'd have to go home and research it myself and do it myself. And so this was something that slowly evolved over the years until the last several years. And when I retired and started writing, I started working on more of the correlations so I would have more content in the books to write about. And my readers were asking me questions about where that was coming from and what inspired me to think that way. What would inspire me to think that an AI would decode prophecy? And I had to explain that. And so I wrote the book as my way of, and actually I fully anticipated I would give away more copies of this. My other books are designed to make money. This one was designed to simply document a unique way of thinking about prophecy that I've never seen anybody else take. And maybe it resonates with some people and maybe it doesn't, but since I have nothing to sell, It was an honest effort to say, this is my search for the truth about what does prophecy mean. It does have relevance to today. It does talk about world systems. It does help us understand who they are and why they're wrong. And it helps me to basically refocus on, within all of that, who is it spiritually that I want to be? And then focus on that. It allowed me to get rid of a lot of clutter in trying to find meaning in the world.
We all can hope for that. So with this, this is a wonderful statement. It's not the end of the podcast, but it would be a perfect ending, so to say. So we have a halfway point ending. Could you spend a couple of minutes to a little bit go to your books that you said are designed to sell? They are written juicy, they're full of color, but look a little bit on can you analyze it for us from a spiritual perspective? I know that you said Indiana Jones and Da Vinci Code, and this is the stuff that I also really wanted to talk about, because how you find this inspiration, how you choose which themes to put forward, and again, can you a little bit bring us inside of your writing mind, if be so kind?
When I retired, I was done trying to make lots of money for already rich people. I knew, and all of these things that I had been experiencing through my career were kind of burning in me. And I knew I wanted to write, but I had to kind of find the vehicle. And actually I realized that I had already done so years ago, and I resurrected that vehicle. And I wanted to write because I could sense, as my prophecy analytics was leading me to conclude and leading me to reinterpret world systems, it started me realizing that, as I mentioned, we might be the ones leading to our own destruction. If that were to be true, we have to be able to see evidence of it, and I need to be able to it needs to be in plain sight, and I should be able to find those issues. So I started by going back to, we mentioned AI. The books that involve this series that are out so far, there's a couple of more coming in 27, 28. But the 3 books out so far, I started publishing in 2020 with the first book called Swarm. Now, Swarm deals with 2 true stories that I fictionalized in order to illustrate the dangers. The first story was based on a spy program that escaped the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories at Sandia and was never recaptured. The program wasn't lost, the program wasn't stolen, and it didn't malfunction. According to the Associated Press, the program had escaped, and they gave me 2 names, an FBI agent and a doctor at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories, to contact. I didn't contact either one. Instead, I cut this little blurb out, and I put it on my monitor, and I sat there for a couple of months saying, is that a typo? Did they mean to say the program was lost or stolen or malfunctioned? Or was it a slip? Did they mean to say it had escaped? And I said, and so using all of my technical understanding, and I'm not an architect, but I'm a business guy who works with architects. So I started looking at researching, how would I have to architect a program so that it could escape a government laboratory and so that they couldn't find it? And then I went to ask the question, why would the government design a program like that? What kind of espionage operation was it designed to do that it needed that ability to move itself and be invisible? Spent close to a year solving those problems. Now, at this point, it was all theoretical in my head. It was one of my innate nerdy curiosities that just kept eating at me when I turned off television and everything else. It was like, okay, how did they do that? Why did they do that? Well, I went to a friend of mine, and he was indie film producer. And so we decided that rather than do a whole full script and try and sell this as a feature, let's pilot the idea of this, because it was a radical idea. And I had been working on early versions of what we now call artificial intelligence throughout my career. So I had an understanding of some of those early versions of what AI looked like. And so we decided to build a webisode series based on this. We called it Cracks in the Web. We wrote like 12 or 15 episodes. We hired out-of-work actors. We did photo shoots. We developed digital sets. We produced these episodes. We won 25 awards We were popular everywhere from China to Israel to Europe to even a flight director for NASA's Houston Space Center was one of my biggest fans and would email me almost every other week. 2 weeks, we got optioned by one of the studios, and 2 weeks before the option was due, 2 FBI agents showed up at my door. They were not very happy. Being a street kid and being an honest person who'd solved this honestly by not hacking anything or stealing anything, I knew I hadn't broken any laws, which gave me the ability to be absolutely obnoxiously giddy. I did it. I figured it out. You wouldn't be here if I was wrong. This is so cool. I'm telling all my friends. They gave me the "We are not amused" speech. My wife came home and gave me the "Why are there two FBI agents in my dining room" speech. As far as I'm concerned, it was the best night ever. That story, though, that experience inspired this character of a AI in the swarm that decodes prophecy and is looking at various elements around the world, elections, Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, financial systems, bankruptcy, cryptocurrencies, all of these elements, climate, that are looking at what's going on in the world. And it's going through and it's interpreting, the AI is interpreting things in a unique way, not with a lot of religious dogma or theology or terminology. And it's trying to warn the characters who are in a process of growing their own spirituality from somewhat agnostic to being more deeply spiritual. And so their journey is along the lines of this AI pointing out how these different events in history are bringing us closer to human annihilation. And so Swarm starts a series, and it deals with not only this program that escaped, but it deals with the cybersecurity issues in America and why America is the most vulnerable country on earth from a cyber attack. It deals with lethal autonomous weapons. Now, I wrote this in 2018. It published in 2020. The world is just now catching up with lethal autonomous weapons a couple of weeks ago with the story from Anthropic. But I've known that this was in progress for over almost a decade now. And so I wanted to talk about lethal autonomous weapons. Go ahead.
Just one question. These not only based on your book, but basically, do you see the possibility of an AI, as you just described it, to become an entity, a spiritual leader or semi-god? Do you see the possibility of itself or seeing itself as a entity of such kind? You know that you triggered me because I podcast about AI, and one really sees that they are starting to think on their own, or we don't know what they're thinking. So do you imagine this as a possibility?
Yes. And in fact, in the series, I walk through some of the evolutions of this program and how it moves towards a super level of intelligence and then to a sentient level of intelligence using quantum computing algorithms, right? Which gets back to the science of what brings our own consciousness. Now, in that process, as it becomes pretty much indestructible and very powerful, it goes through its own delusions. And so we're gonna explore that as we go through the story. But as we've gone through the story now, the last arc, the next book in the series, deals with the ideas that prophecy needs to require a third temple. And so it deals with that issue in Israel. And in my research, I discovered that there were actually, I realized that a temple doesn't really have any spiritual meaning without an Ark of the Covenant, and a sacrifice doesn't really have value unless you have an ark to sprinkle it on. So while there was all the talk about the 5 red heifers for a sacrifice, and there's all these talks about we have all the implements for a temple, there's a number of things blocking that. One, the location being that they want to put it over the Dome of the Rock, which is the wrong location. And 2, they needed an Ark of the Covenant, which caused me to research that. So in my research, I realized that there were actually 2 of them made. One of them is discussed, or the hiding place of it is discussed in the copper scroll that was found in the 60s. And about, I guess, 14 years ago now, a guy named, oh my gosh, I'm now going to draw a mental block on his name. There was a guy that decoded the copper scroll and found all 6 locations.
His assistant is coming next week to my podcast.
Is that the guy who discovered that?
His assistant is coming to my podcast
Oh, his
next
assistant.
week.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I read the book, the Copper Scroll Project. I believed a lot of it. I also read a couple of other books around the Temple Mount and the location for the right location for the Temple Mount, which isn't under the Dome of the Rock. That rock is not the right kind of stone. The right kind of stone is the kind of stone that you would drag seeds over to basically remove the flakes. That stone is actually 70 yards northwest of the Dome of the Rock, under the dome cupola called the Dome of the Spirit, which lines up perfectly with the Golden Gate. That's the original location of the temple. And so in this second arc, I created a fictional narrative of how our heroes could be. The AI is leading our heroes to these breadcrumbs where he's discovering about this copper scroll. And most people don't know this, that the Ark of the Covenant that was in Ethiopia in September of 2021, a militia stormed that church, massacred 750 men, women, and children, including the guardian, and took that Ark. It sold on the black market. We don't know where, but I speculate where in the book. And so I was bringing together a story of saying, well, if a third temple were to happen, are there physical elements in the world today that would make that even plausible? And of course, the act of doing it would be an act of war, would cause a war. And so what we're seeing now, I can't verify this, but I've seen some people who were close to the red heifer, the Sanhedrin and the red heifer incident, who said that they had planned to sacrifice the red heifer on Rosh Hashanah in 2023, and they believe that was the reason why the massacre started in Gaza. So some of these things are relevant to our real world, not necessarily in how I write them, but in the major issues I'm trying to bring up. So the last book, The Image, so the one that came out in 2025, has won Literary Excellence Award. No, the first two books won a Gold Award, Silver Award, Book of the Year Award. The Image won a International Impact Award and Literary Excellence Award out of London. And that one deals with the lost history of the Shroud of Turin that dates back to the 1st century when it was called the Image of Edessa, and how that correlates to cryptocurrency, international banking, and our AI now gaining prominence. So we're dealing with a number of different global issues. There's an assassination. You got to have your enough thriller elements to keep the page turning, but woven within that are these elements to say one of the next phases to come that will be highly disruptive will be a switch in banking to a cryptocurrency. And that will enrich a certain class of people and create a technical feudalism on a broader population from just a logistical perspective. So I'm trained as a master in economy, as an economist. And so it's one of the issues I've been concerned with, which was the debt ratios and the push towards how they're going to get out of that. And we're reaching the point where, and the government right now is already working on this behind the scenes with a couple of different movements to try and switch over our debt to pay it off with cryptocurrency, which would create a financial disaster. So some of the things I'm writing about in the book I'm always trying to look 2 or 3 years ahead of what could be happening. I'm trying to read the tea leaves. And there's always 3 themes. There's always a theme of the dangers of artificial intelligence, where it's going and how that could be bad. There's always a theme of the corruption and collapse of our geopolitical systems, especially starting here in America. And the third theme is how all of that correlates to prophecy in plain sight and feeds into the spiritual arc, the arc of the characters.
Well, let me make a statement, even if not necessary, but when you're listing all these awards that you have received, it is nearly completely immature to sit here and say, I'm so happy to listen to you, because imagining a young person who is not into spirituality yet, finding your books because of the AI, because of the thriller, because of the page turner, and reading about prophecies the first time, reading about all of these juicy stuff. This is exactly what the world needs, because I am into serious spirituality. I teach meditation more than 30 years. That's my world, and there's no thriller, there's no arcs and nothing. You just sit and connect with the source. And it is horribly boring, to say the truth. It's definitely no page turner, sitting quietly.
Bingo, bingo. And that's exactly why I chose that format. Michael Crichton was a medical doctor. He was very concerned, and he decided to be an author. Now, he was very concerned with cloning and DNA manipulations, as were many of us. Now, he could have. Now, I've written a prophecy analytics book and an AI book about the technical stuff, and they're not page turners. they're the factual stuff that I had to, that basically provides credibility. But to say that I'm not making this stuff up, I'm not making up a story of a program that escaped the NSA. I'm not making up what the AI can do and what it might be able to do in this very near future. But Michael Crichton wrote Jurassic Park because he wants to not just say cloning DNA could be bad. He wanted to say cloning and using DNA manipulation could be bad because it could be usurped by greed and bias and hubris and pride, and it's always those elements that distort our discoveries. And he wanted to basically say that it's not the technology that's bad, it's what we do with it that could lead to evil. And that's the point I'm trying to make with AI. The AI is neither evil nor benign, but AI, powerful, super intelligent, hyper powerful intelligence in the hands of a sociopathic billionaire, a corrupt CEO or politician, a drug lord, a crime lord, a dictator, or a despot. Put in the hands of those people, we're empowering the corruption, and that will not lead, even though AI has enormous benefits to humanity, we will not fully realize those benefits unless we can put guardrails on the things that could go wrong. And that's what we're not doing proactively. So my books are there to say, we're not doing a good job at managing what we create. We're not doing a good enough job at being aware of who our leaders are and where they're leading us. And all of that should be calling up within us a deeper sense of spirituality to root ourselves in the face of this tsunami that's coming. And that doesn't mean necessarily going to a church or a religion, but but spirituality, religion is the institutionalizing of a unique individual experience of faith that is a quantum connection between our consciousness and the consciousness of the greater universe and dimensions that we don't perceive, just like we don't perceive all spectrums of light, just like we can't perceive all spectrums of vibration. We can't perceive all spectrums of the universe, but there's scientific evidence and there's anecdotal evidence and there's lots of evidence that they exist. In fact, every single theory of physics, the math leads them to believe that there's higher levels of dimensions in the universe. We just can't prove it yet. And so CERN is working on, one of the themes in the book, The Image, is CERN is working on a set of experiments called the Atlas Project. They're trying to create a mini black hole using dark matter in order to prove that gravity is shared by this dimension and other dimension. Basically, they want to prove a fifth dimension. In my book, The Image, I have my AI helps them succeed, and that opens a dimension, a portal of communication that we then start to bring in some of this understanding of our own spirituality being a personal connection, a personal quantum connection, as opposed to a communal or institutional connection.
The valid point for sure. It is, that's why you have a spiritual podcast to talk over and over the question if it's an individual connection or if it's a shared connection as well, or if it's both or all of it, or this is what I'm up and down the square podcasting all year long.
I know I touch on a lot of sensitive topics, and I try to do so without necessarily saying that I'm right and others are wrong. It's just the way I'm perceiving things, and my hope is to just provoke thought, just to help people think about themselves, their own spirituality, their own beliefs, where they stand, and what they believe.
And this is maybe the most important thing, because if I talk with the younger generation who are now shamans or whatever, they're 20-something, you can always, even if they don't like to hear it, when I kind of a little bit poke them with Harry Potter, they get very grumpy. But then after a couple of minutes, it just sneaks through. The dream has to start somewhere, right?
It has to start someplace.
It
That
has to start
we're connected to more than what we can see. The physical universe is not the whole universe.
But
And
I would also, I just really want to add something to your explanation of who is behind the AI and those guys. And for me, from my little perspective at the corner, I see a lot of people who are horribly afraid of dying and who are trying to prolong life. And I'm sure you're a great scholar, so Golem, Frankenstein up and down the square. We've been there, the golden cow, over and over when people want to become gods and immortality. And I have such a big fear that a lot of these billionaires that you're talking about who are running these AI systems really trying to find a way to escape. And this immortality drive is one of the most disruptive forces, I think, on Earth, when people cannot come to terms with the fact that we live and die. For me, this is super scary.
and you're right. And in the image, I actually touch on that. One of my major characters dies and has a near-death experience. And it allows us to talk about the dimensions of life. I can bring in other near-death experiences. We could bring in some of those. Most of those are actually very positive experiences. Only very minor of those are dark, but they tell us of a different dimension. The process that they all go through is the same. And it tells me that I think that because we are so hooked into the physical world, our total understanding is so carnally connected that it's hard for us to necessarily disconnect from that and envision our consciousness outside of that. But not only do near-death experiences speak to that experience, but some of the scientific realms do, some of the paranormal studies do, and even the CIA is famous for some of their experiments in out-of-body experiments and consciousness outside of the physical constraints of where the body is. And so we can take some assurance, especially people who are seeking spirituality and trying to find those truths in a sincere, honest way, I believe will find that path at that moment. I don't believe that when I die, that's the end of me. What that experience will look like exactly, I don't know, and it doesn't necessarily matter. Because I've heard the testimonies of enough people, and I've understood the technologies, the understanding of the physical universe, and spirituality is just simply our attempts to understand the spirituality of that extra dimensions. There's enough anecdotal and experiential evidence in that through visions and prophecies and testimonies and paranormal experiences that we've documented over the centuries that we can say that there's something there. And we don't need to necessarily be afraid. But what is important is what legacy we leave here. Are we going to leave a legacy of greed and selfishness and being focused on wealth and power and fame and things that are going to evaporate at that moment our consciousness extends? Or are we focused on the things that will extend into that realm as well? Compassion, empathy, people, our humanity with each other, loving each other. Those are the things that will last that dimensional boundary. And so, to me, even though it does point us in that direction, the fact is, we all have a terminal disease, that it's a 100% fact. I heard a doctor said death rate is 100%. I said, yeah, we're all going to do that. So why be afraid of something we're all going to experience? And it's more important to understand how we're living and how much we get hooked into our idols and our distractions and the things that distort us, social media and video games, and even political newscasts and newscasts about building wealth. All those things have to be put in a balanced perspective to the core of our spirituality, the core of our existence, which is our spirituality.
I couldn't agree with you more. It is exactly the big benefit of a spiritual journey that once you reach the light or even a little bit scratch on the light, I would not say you lose the fear of dying, but you have a certainty of another world. And this certainty, some people get it through prayer, some people get it for church community. There's so many ways. It doesn't have to be meditation, doesn't have to be this, doesn't have to be that. But all of these, first of all, but the problem is to reach this step, you need humbleness and you need submission. And that's the great, we cannot be part of a circle in a church and be the boss there. You have to be one of the prayers. And with meditation, if you try to tell the universe, now you must come, it's not going to come.
Well, I have post-traumatic stress, so meditation is very difficult for me because my mind has just a different way of working. But I absolutely agree that we need to focus on that. And I don't, that it has to become, I don't know if we can ever fully understand. I think the journey is always going to be there. I think the searching always has to be there. Questions always need to be there because we don't know and we really don't have a full understanding. And in religion, they call it theology because it's a theory about spiritual issues. In science, they call it theory because it's a theory about scientific issues. But we're all trying to form those theories and form an understanding ourselves while we're here and that transition. And so the books are really about looking at the world in a real way and taking away, I think it's also important that we take away some of the clutter so that we're seeing the world in a more transparent way. We're not seeing a political leader as a savior. We're not seeing making that first $1 million as what will make us happy. We're not seeing, we can get rid of some of the clutter about what matters and what doesn't matter and who's right and who's wrong and hatred this group and the tribalism of that group. And part of that spiritual journey for me, it was important for me because in my job, I had to be extremely highly informed in all of those areas. I had to saturate myself in news and in all of these things going on in order to guide a corporation, the strategy of a corporation, where we're going to be not next month, but in 3 years, 5 years. And so it was a intentional decoupling for me from some of the informational clutter that we got right now in order to try to refocus on what was more important and get more in touch with those things. And I think it's hard to really, for a lot of people, I know they want to be more spiritual, but they're still in that clutter, and that makes it much more difficult.
Guy Morris, I wish you many, many more books because I wish us many more books from you, being able to read them, to enjoy, and to bring that spark to the next generation and throughout the world. Because as long as the spark is alive, I know you talk about prophecies and it's taken very serious, and I think we should take them seriously. But I allow myself to be calm and sleep good at night, as long as I know there are people out there who keep the search alive and keep the spark alive. I do not fear in that sense. I take the warning seriously, but I sleep like a baby because the search is on, and I pray. And I always say every night one prayer: I hope I will never find enlightenment, because I want to keep searching for it. And that's my wish. Thank you so very much for joining this podcast.